certainly have fears that there is a serial killer at loose in Perth.
Sarah Spears, Jane Rimmer, Ciara Glennon.
And every time you saw a young girl walking by, you think, oh God, is she going to be the next victim?
Now, one man stands accused.
If police are right and Edwards is the Claremont serial killer, he's been hiding in plain sight for 20 years.
Today, the trial of the century resumed. With strict social distancing in the courtroom, Bradley Edwards took his place in the dock. Welcome to day 60 of Claremont in Conversation. I'm Natalie Bonjolo. Joining us for week 15, Legal Affairs Editor at the West Australian, Tim Clark, and forensic scientist Brendan Chapman. Well, it's been a 10-day adjournment, and Tim, COVID-19 has changed the world in that time. What was it like being in court today?
A lot quieter than it has been the last 15, 20 weeks, Nat. I've got to say, there was literally one person that wasn't directly involved in the case in court. Media accepted. I suppose we're not directly involved, but we are involved in some way. Mr. and Mrs. Edwards were there. The accused man's parents were there, but no other person, apart from one lonely public observer. Police, obviously, but they were pared down. Lawyers, obviously, but they were pared down as well. And the media were there, but we were very acute in our awareness that we had to spread ourselves out. So yes, it was a very different atmosphere, I have to say, than what we've been used to. And Justice Hall, again, directly addressed what would be happening in the coming weeks to attempt to keep the trial running amid the world seemingly ending around us.
Yeah.
And that will include, as we mentioned last week, some audio that will go up to allow people who don't or can't come to the court being able to follow it via the website, the Supreme Court website. There will be strict cleanliness regimes used, including how the lawyers get their documents as they need to be into court. Hand sanitizer will be used, although it was in quite short supply, as it is everywhere else in Australia. We even heard that the Justice Hall's orderly had attempted to make some of her own over the weekend to try and supply the court, but she didn't have any, a little success. Whether she'll go back to her recipe tonight, we're not sure.
With millions of others, I expect.
Indeed, yes. And more use will be made in the coming days and weeks of video evidence to be given remotely, either in the court or from witnesses' own personal residences on a secure line, if they don't feel that they're confident enough or well enough to come into court.
Yeah. And I imagine there must be some kind of a sense of urgency, really, because Justice Hall would wanting to be getting this trial to the finish line before it gets stopped in some other way.
Yeah, I think that's fair, although obviously he's got a very tricky balancing act, because he doesn't want to be seen to be rushing any witnesses or any evidence to the detriment of that evidence coming out. So obviously he's still got to be, it's still got to all be done in an orderly way and in a very forensic way and a very complete way, because he doesn't want any evidence being missed or glossed over or not given to him that needs to be for the sake of trying to get it done. But what we did hear today, Nat, was that time spent last week away from court, some listeners might remember that I mentioned that Mr. Jovic was going to go through the fibre evidence very in great detail before it started to see if they could agree on any portions of it. And it would appear that has happened, because Ms. Barbara Gallo said today that a lot of witnesses, or at least 20 witnesses that were anticipated to be coming into court, will now be read in. And so Ms. Barbara Gallo estimated that might halve the time that we spend on the fibre evidence from 10 weeks down to 5.
Wow.
Now, that wasn't done, I don't think that was done in light of the current global health crisis, but it certainly will speed up the process, it sounds like, which I think will be a relief to everyone. in terms of getting the trial over the finish line, or certainly getting the prosecution case over the finish line, because obviously, like any public gathering at the moment, whether it be legal or social, it's on a knife edge, and any slight hint that any of the participants might have been exposed in any way could jeopardise the whole thing.
So the statements will be read in, as opposed to some of these people appearing as witnesses in person,
Yes.
which means Mr. Jovic has had to agree to that, and he doesn't have the opportunity then to cross-examine those witnesses.
Yes, correct. But he was given that time last week, the whole of last week, away from court to go through that process to see what he would be satisfied as being read in and unchallenged, basically. And he has obviously agreed to that, so as to really hone down what the issues are in terms of fibres. So he's obviously comfortable enough to do that in his own mind, so he can really concentrate on what he feels the issues will be in terms of fibres, and the witnesses that he really feels that he needs to question in person, in cross-examination, in court.
Yeah. Well, your the fibre portion of the trial did get underway, and the first person you heard from was Senior Sergeant George Patton.
Yes, so he is a forensic officer who was involved in macro for many, many years at a very senior level. In fact, we heard today that it was his job to go through all the evidence in totality in 2008, perform a review and go to his superior officers with suggestions of what might be forensically possible. And so it was Sergeant Patton who went to then Deputy Commissioner Chris Dawson to suggest that they use FSS, low copy number 2008 fingernails, which we've poured over in so much detail in the last few weeks. So a very central figure in terms of the forensic police officers involved in the case, and that was revealed more fully today because he was centrally involved in fibres, in transporting evidence to and from the UK and other places. And what we heard most about today, he was very centrally involved in the examination of Jane's hair in 2009, when that hair was first taken out of the frozen storage where it had been since 1996, and then very, very closely looked at by forensic officers, chemists, chem centre people. So that's more polylight and physical examination of the hair, and he was present at that, and it was his job to do a running sheet, so basically record everything that was being done to Jane's hair on those 4 days that it was looked at, and record it, and then it was his job to come to court today and to detail exactly what was done during that examination.
Brendan, can you just talk to us a little bit about fibres, and is this an area of specialty, and what sort of things could we expect in a trial where fibre evidence is important?
Yeah, sure. So it is an area of specialty, I suppose, and it falls under the greater heading, I suppose, of what we generally call chemical criminalistics, which is mostly undertaken by the state chemistry laboratories, I suppose, and that's largely because a lot of the techniques used to analyse fibres are similar techniques and similar pieces of instruments that are housed by those sort of agencies. So it's a process whereby we basically are categorising fibres by a number of factors. So it's not like a DNA, I suppose, where you say the match is of X matches Y, but we can certainly narrow down, obviously, where a fibre may have come from or or the source material on the basis of a number of things such as colour and how it's made up. So the fibre may be from clothing that's nylon, it could be from clothing that's woolen, it could be from a range of different artificially or naturally occurring types of or sources, I suppose.
Yeah. And is Western Australia, do you know, are we leaders in this area, or are there particular labs around the world that are leaders in this field?
Yeah, so WA has actually been quite at the forefront of establishing what we would refer to, I suppose, as fibre databasing, which is where we, just like DNA or just like other forensic sort of fields where we have a database of a whole range of different fibres that we've seen, and then we can kind of match them to a database. And the Chem Centre, as the WA agency that does that, is very recently published data on the development of that, which I'm sure we'll hear more about.
Yeah. Tim, back to Senior Sergeant Patton today. It was interesting that he talked about in 2008 when he sent some exhibits to FSS, and it was interesting that he was the one who recognised that there were these pristine samples and how valuable they could be.
Yeah, so as I briefly mentioned there, Sergeant Patton was one of the officers that was tasked with the massive task of reviewing every physical exhibit that existed in the macro investigation, going back, that dated back 12, 13 years by that time, where they were stored, if they were stored, how they were logged, how they were catalogued, and what possible opportunities existed from any of them that maybe hadn't been explored previously because of scientific breakthroughs and developments over the course of those many, many years. And as you said, Matt, he was the one that realised that AJM40, the thumbnail, which we've talked about so much, and AJM48 had never been opened, let alone examined the pots that they were in particular the yellow top containers. And so he recognised that, and then recognised the possibility of low copy number testing. It had just been 3 years before that. That technique had been used at FSS in the Bradley Murdoch murder trial, which resulted in a major breakthrough and a major conviction in another jurisdiction in Australia. The technology didn't exist in Australia also, so it couldn't be done here. And so he took it up the chain of command, got an immediate tick-off from the Deputy Commissioner Dawson, who basically said, get it done. And within a week, he had the meeting on the 22nd of August. By the 29th of August, all this stuff was packed up and ready to go to the UK. And given it had taken 12 years to get to that point, to get that stuff out of storage into secure envelopes and ready to be transported to the UK within a week, you can see how urgent the senior police thought this opportunity was. As it turned out, it took 3 months for the fingernails to get tested because they had these other samples that they believed were more important at the time. We heard a little bit more about that today. These were hairs that were found, particularly on Jane, that police believed were what they call foreign to her, so they weren't her hairs. So they were really interested in those, and they went to the top of the pile for examination at FSS. But as it turned out, it was those pristine exhibits that Sergeant Patton had also recognised that turned out to be the crucial ones.
I mean, it's quite insightful, isn't it? Because we're not talking about a forensic scientist, we're talking about a police officer who has seen this, recognised it, understood that if he sent it overseas, he might be able to find something.
Well, yes, and to have the seniority and trust of his senior officers. I'm pretty sure if it had been a lowly constable that had walked into Deputy Commissioner Dawson's office and said, can we expend vast amounts of time, expense and manpower to take these tiny little pieces of fingernail over to the UK for the possibility that they might lead to something. Deputy Commissioner Dawson might have been a little less forthcoming in his tick off, but Sergeant Patton had been involved in macro for years, and he's still involved in macro to this day. And so obviously had the trust of his senior officers to such an extent that they said, yeah, George, let's do it. Let's see if this could be the thing that breaks it open. And in fact, it might well be.
So, Tim, you've talked about Jane Rimmer. This is really the first sort of day that we've heard anything in depth about the physical evidence found on Jane Rimmer. What was that about?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, this is Jane's hair mass that was taken holeless from her body during the post-mortem, was placed into storage and was basically not touched for many, many years after that. It was placed in a bucket, a billy bucket, which is one of these plastic storage buckets with secure lids on, and was placed into frozen storage. This was now in 2009, and it was felt after this major DNA breakthrough at the end of 2008, beginning of 2009. That was when everything in macro ramped up again, and everything was looked at again. And this was part of that re-examination or upping of the level of examination. So Jane's hair was taken out of storage and it was literally frozen. The initial examination notes we saw today said the hair was in one big mass, and we actually did see photographs of Jane's hair today in court, shown in court, which was allowed by Justice Hall because of the lack of anyone in court really other than police, media, and lawyers. So it was felt that there was enough responsibility for the people in court that they would be able to handle seeing that, and so we did. And the hair was in one large mass, and it was actually frozen in place. So it had actually taken on the shape of the bucket that it had been in for all those years. Once it was taken out and placed on a large piece of blotting paper or a drop sheet, it was then obviously left to thaw a little bit, and then it was split up into 5 sections. Well, it was teased apart first, so it became a lot easier to look at and a lot easier to work with. And then all those pieces of hair were placed into 5 different areas, if you like, and they were all then examined individually. And various tests were done on them. The presumptive test for blood, the Castle-Meyer test as it's known. There was a presumptive test for semen also done on all these sections of hair, and they were also looked at with a polylight, which is the alternative light source that CSI fans will have seen, that shows up things that might not be visible to the naked eye. And then also all the other bits of debris that came out off the hair as it was being examined and as it was being thawed out, that had dropped onto this sheet, they were also all examined to a greater or lesser extent. And Sergeant Patton said today that the examination was done for multiple reasons, as I say, looking for blood, looking for semen, looking for vegetation, and also looking for fibres. And so that is what was done over 4 separate days. It took to tease the hair apart first, and then go through all the various stages and all the various tests on all the separate areas. And Sergeant Patton was basically sat in the corner of a room, logging everything that was done onto a computer, onto a running sheet contemporaneously, and that running sheet stretched to 17 pages. So you can see how meticulous that examination was, and what we've got from it, although we didn't get to that today, the prosecution says is that in this examination and a further examination done in 2012, 22 critical fibres that the prosecution says link Jane directly to Mr. Edwards' car and Mr. Edwards' work attire were found during those 2 examinations.
And that's what we'll hear about in coming weeks. Brendan,
Yes.
I'm curious, how long has a polylite been around, and why would that not have been put over the hair samples a decade before?
So I couldn't tell you exactly, Nat, but I can tell you that they've been around for probably at least 20 years. But the old ones, and we're going back now, I suppose, but the first ones that were really quite high-powered, as in with enough power to be able to really differentiate different fibres and the like, were all kind of mains-powered. So now we've got the capability with, really high-power batteries and stuff that we can basically have these within what looks like a torch and portable and taken to scenes. But historically, these were really expensive pieces of equipment that needed to be mains powered and basically kind of lived in labs because they weren't particularly portable either. So that's probably my best explanation for why it would have been used kind of at a later date and in more of a laboratory environment. The other thing is when you're looking for fibres, you really want to be in a very controlled environment because these are almost microscopic and very, very easily transferable and lost. So they're not the sort of thing that you really want to be undertaking an examination for fibres, say out in the open outside at a crime scene.
What does it look like when you are looking at a sample and you spot a fibre? Can you describe it for us?
So using an alternative light source, the best comparison is probably what everyone knows as a black light or those kind of nightclub UV lights that you'll notice when, depending on what you're wearing, but some clothing will really fluoresce. So you probably, or the listeners might be familiar with, for instance, a nightclub where you're wearing, say, a white cotton shirt and you get in the nightclub and it has that really quite glowing sort of bluey purple hue.
Yes.
That's the sort of effect that the various different wavelengths of these alternative light sources or polylights can have. But it just depends on the colour of the fibre as to what that kind of emitted light is. So white, for instance, with that kind of ultraviolet wavelength gives you back that kind of blue hue, whereas, different colour fibres will give off different hues. And the main thing you're trying to exploit there is the characteristics of the fibre compared to the background. So if you've got a piece of clothing that's got, say, it's a black piece of clothing, then some fibres on that will be really easy to pick up with different wavelengths of these polylights. So pretty similar sort of thing, again, to go back to the nightclub where you might have bits of fluff on a piece of clothing that you never really realised was on it. Perhaps that shirt went through the wash with a towel, and then you get into the nightclub and you realise you've got all these tiny little fluorescent flecks all over your lovely black shirt that you've just ironed and gone out in. So that's kind of what we're expecting to see and what we do see.
That takes me back to my university days now, I've got to say.
I was thinking the same thing, actually. I could visualise the light at the nightclub. And Brendan, how then do you actually collect that fibre?
Yeah, there's a number of ways we can do it. Obviously, the simple and most direct procedure is to tweeze them off, or using tweezers or forceps to actually individually pick fibres off and place them into something like a petri dish or a storage vessel. If we're looking to scan a larger area or perhaps lift fibres off an entire garment, we can use what's called tape lifting, which is not any more technical than it probably sounds, which is where we can use strips of like masking tape essentially and stick them down on the clothing and then tear those off. And with them comes a whole bunch of the fibres originating from the clothing, obviously, and any foreign ones on the surface as well. And the good thing about that sort of technique is because of the adhesiveness of the tape, they're relatively immobilised on that tape. So we kind of overcome the problem of these fibres being very transferable and easily lost.
And once a fibre has, glowing under the blue light, can you then sometimes see it with the naked eye?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
A fibre can be anything from what you would think of as a little offcut of some cotton on the hem of some clothing down to what that's actually made of. So if you were to take a piece of cotton from the hem of your clothing, you'll see that it's quite thick, but it's actually made up of a whole bunch of smaller fibres within that. And a fibre, by definition, can really be anything ranging from the width of that original length of cotton to all of those smaller widths that make it up.
Okay. And with a sample such as in this case Jane's hair that has been frozen, taken out and examined again, can that hair exhibit be used again after that? I'm just thinking about the DNA. Once you've used it, you've used it. With Jane's hair sample, it's been taken from the freezer, it's been examined. Can it go back into the freezer for a later date to be examined again in case there was some kind of new technology?
Yeah, absolutely. It's in the scheme of DNA, for instance, it's just like any other exhibit. As long as it's kept cold and dark and stored away, then the DNA is viable. Fibres don't really have any life expectancy as such. The only thing we really need to be concerned about is if they're getting dislodged or lost from the exhibit. But there's certainly no reason why it can't go back in a freezer or a fridge and be examined for a later date.
Tim, was Sergeant Patton cross-examined today?
Yes, he was, Nat, briefly. And it mainly, the cross-examination mainly surrounded one of these documents that he produced, which related to evidence stored by the WA police, and it went to something that DS Jim Stanbury had been questioned about many, many weeks ago now, in regards to the documentation of some of the exhibits and how well they were documented and labelled. It got a bit tetchy at times. Sergeant Patton and Mr. Yovich had a little bit of a back and forth. But to be honest, this was a little bit of hole poking by Mr. Yovich, trying to show that maybe some of the documentation done by the police over the course of the investigation wasn't absolutely spick and span, but it doesn't really go to any of the major exhibits. So it wasn't really of significance in terms of the whole case. What I neglected to mention was that Sergeant Patton, in his evidence in chief, did actually detail how the surroundings of the examination were done in, and it went exactly to what Brendan had talked about there. A special room had been set up in DNA cleanliness stakes, if you want to put it that way, with the full PPE, masks, gloves, hair nets, robes, like everything was done in 2009. This is that possibly could have been done to try and prevent a contamination, because by this stage, obviously, police knew potentially what they were looking for, because there had been this DNA breakthrough and how important this examination might be. But we are going to hear that C word a lot, the contamination, again, because we already know that Mr. Yovich has asked many of the witnesses who were at the post-mortem what their practices were in terms of potential contamination in terms of fibres, and continuity and fibre and contamination will be again, a major issue in the coming weeks, because that, we think, is where the defence is going to go into how some of these fibres might have come to be on the physical exhibits that we're talking about today. It's Jane's hair. We know that Ciara's hair is going to be a major player in the fibres, as are Ciara's clothes, particularly her shirt, which was investigated by the FBI, and they did scrapings off that shirt, which prosecutors will say also turned up some of these fibres.
Yeah, so I guess, like you said, it's just like DNA. We can expect a lot of detail about how anything could have been possibly contaminated. Brendan, is contamination a big issue with fibre evidence in cases?
I couldn't tell you categorically, Nat, because I'm not aware of any cases where fibres have been such a pivotal matter. But just like DNA, they're very easily transferred from one area or from one person to another. And I suppose, unlike DNA, fibres can kind of literally jump out of tubes or plates, because there's some characteristics of fibres that with static electricity, for instance, on plastics, they can become adhered, or they can actually kind of hop off. So I'm quite interested to see how some of that's going to play out. But yeah, it certainly is very similar to DNA in the sense of we're talking about something incredibly small. We're talking about something that's incredibly transferable.
Well, this is going to be very interesting then. Well, thank you both for your time today, and thank you for your company. Your feedback is most welcomed. We're at claremontpodcast@wanews.com.au, and we'll be back tomorrow, Tim, myself and Alison Fan, for day 61 of Claremont in Conversation.
This podcast was produced by Kate Ryan and Alicia Preedy and recorded in the studios of 7 West Media. Audio files were provided from the archives of the 7 Network and the West Australian. Sign up for daily emails and all the latest on the Claremont trial at thewest.com.au.
Flashpoint, returning to 7 on Mondays at 9 p.m, demanding change and discussing issues that matter to West Australians.